So thank you, everyone. Wow, this is confusing. Right, error. Okay. Okay, so I'd like to start off by just showing this data from the Lustre survey that OpenSFS conducted earlier on this year. Now, as you might expect, to be clear, this is Lustre versions in use at the respondents, and both serve either servers or clients. So many sites have multiple file systems at different versions, and maybe sometimes there's a mismatch of versions. So we do get a spread here. As you might expect, there's strong concentrations around versions which have had maintenance releases with them. And obviously notable is that there's still very strong usage of 1.8 out there. As you might expect, many deployments remain in production for until the cluster is taken out of service, so that's always a factor. But for me, what's really interesting here is the strong uptake of Lustre 2.4. At the time this survey was conducted, it was less than a year since 2.4.0 had been released, and yet still there's a really strong presence of Lustre 2.4. Now, historically, we've always seen fairly slow, modest uptake early on as releases come out. In fact, recently I stumbled over a presentation I gave at LUG in 2010, which for some reason is not the presentation that people remember from 2010, but anyway. And that was basically all trying to encourage people that Lustre 1.8 wasn't so bad because of the slow uptake and how people were sticking on 1.6, after a year after 1.8 came out. But yet with 2.4 we've seen this very rapid adoption, which particularly in light of the announcement about switching the maintenance release stream to be 2.5, that was for me quite interesting. Moving on to 2.1. So I've always got a bit of a soft spot for this release because this was the first release we did post-Oracle. And I remember at the first one of these events in 2011, we were testing what turned out to be the GA version at that time, and I was 90% sure that it was going to be the GA, but we still were waiting for some of the testing to come in. And it was shortly after the conference that was declared GA. There was, with Lustre 2.0, there was a great deal of re-engineering of, a lot of foundation work was laid for features which are only just, now coming out in releases, DNE and HSM. That groundwork was laid in 2.0, but for many it was, a lot of change without a lot of payoff for that, accepting that risk that comes along with that change. So the initial uptake on the 2.1 release was very soft. But several of our largest sites, our host CEA, Livermore, NASA, all were very early adopters with 2.1, and we got a lot of they had some issues, and we were able to get those issues addressed and fixed in subsequent maintenance releases. So at this stage, it's been a while since we did a 2.1 release, and while I wouldn't altogether rule it out, I'd say it was fairly unlikely that we'll ever see a 2.1.7. Just there's a significant number of sites running in production, but generally fairly stably. Moving on to 2.4, so that came out back in 2013. So this had was really somewhat of a tipping point for the 2x code line. There's a number of features in there that had been desired for a long time, and so that I think what drew many people to upgrade from 1.8. Of these, I've picked out, there were a number of features, but the three I think are the most noteworthy are DNE, NRS, and ZFS. So with ZFS, we work closely with Livermore, who funded that work in the first place, and and there's often, you see comments on the mailing lists from others who have deployed in that mode. So I'm pretty sure that's being used, reasonably well. But with the other two features, I haven't really encountered many people who are running in production. I know of one university who are running D&E in production, but I've yet to, I know DDN have done some testing with NRS for some, future deployments, but I'm really not familiar with anyone who's running it in production yet. So if anyone is, I'd really like to hear from you about how that's going. We did do a 2.4.3 release earlier this year, which was more of an emergency release because we discovered, we had reported a security issue that just addressed, but we haven't had a full usual maintenance release with, aggregating a lot of bug fixes for a while. It's still possible, but we're not actively working on one at the moment. So with 2.5 code line, that came out about a year ago, and surprisingly, the initial uptake seemed to be fairly slow on that. A lot of people evaluating and but more recently, I've heard a lot of people who are upgrading, either recently have upgraded or plan to in the coming weeks, and so I would expect in next year's survey we'll see a very strong showing from 2.5. The 2.5.3 release came out a couple of weeks ago, which is aggregating a lot of the production experiences for sites running in 2.4 or 2.5, and we'll be putting out a 2.5.4 release before the end of the year. Lustre 2.6 came out a couple of months ago, and it's I know not everyone has either the time or the inclination to follow all the details. I thought I was getting reinforcements there for a moment. So where was I? 2.6. So yes, so probably people may be wondering, why was the release cycle 9 months for 2.6 rather than the usual 6 months? So there's two aspects to that. First of all, we made a conscious choice. We came up to feature freeze, and we've had this practice for some time now of what Eric calls the train model of basically we have a fixed schedule, and if things are ready, then great, and if they're not, we move on. Just like if you turn up 5 minutes after your scheduled departure time for a train, it's gone, right? It's too bad, you wait for the next one. This seems like a pretty good way of working when you have a community development project, because it's just too difficult to work with different priorities across organizations, and having clear parameters everyone understands to work within is the way to go. But while trains may pull out of stations on a regular basis empty, with software releases it's a bit different, because train companies don't need to talk about that empty train for the next 6 months. So we decided to take an extra month. There were a couple of things that were close enough that we felt confident they would be in, and so that was a month on the schedule. And then at the other end of the cycle, where we have the stabilization period, obviously when we work to a rule of thumb that on average 3 months is about right for a stabilization period, but when it comes down to it, we need to make sure that the software is at the right quality before you issue a release, and so we it just took longer than average to do so on this occasion. And I did want to say as well with 2.6 that I think that the end result was a really good release. I'm really happy with the release, and while often the feature releases only don't get used too intensively, I think that 2.6 clients might be used fairly widely, or at least fairly moderately, because it has the single client performance work, and also it has much better newer kernel support, so people who aren't able to work, wait for the next release to get their hands on, get something working with, a newer Red Hat or Ubuntu or something might find that a productive starting point. Chris Morone of Livermore gave this equivalent presentation at LUG, and so I shared Andreas's script that generated this data with him then, and he presented this data in bar charts, and I like pie charts. So, but he enhanced it slightly, and so there's some extra data on the next slide, which I quite like. But with this, this is fairly similar than we've seen previously. Probably the main thing to people ask about is the Oak Ridge data. On your right is the lines of code changed, and that's doesn't seem aligned with the numbers of commits on the left, and that's because of the nature of the work that they've been involved with. The engineer in question, who's responsible for a lot of that, has been working with the newer, doing work to support newer kernels and to work with the Upstream Lustre client, and that has there's a lot of reformatting and deleting old code and such like that touches a lot of lines. So that's why but it's fairly similar patterns being applied across a lot of lines of code. And I also wanted to call out SUSE, which Jeff Mahoney's a senior kernel guy who has been he's worked on some previous releases as well. He gets involved with some of the newer kernel work to sort of help facilitate our support of newer SLES releases, and obviously with the SLES 12 release coming out soon, he's been around. But he doesn't just limit himself to that. He does get participate in other things as well. So just did want to acknowledge that work. And this is the data I was referring to that Chris has added the number of developers to this. So I'd done data like this before with the number of commits, because I think that gives like a nice feeling of how any given release compares to each other in terms of the amount of change. It gives sort of a sense of that. But Chris added this with the number of developers, which I think is a nice touch because it really sort of shows about the amount of people we have working on Lustre, as well as the sort of increasing diversity in the development community across organizations. So I think that's nice if you look, seeing back to, I mean, we did have some contributions back at CFS, Sun and Oracle, but in the .0 releases that was not a factor, whereas the community are more involved now ahead of releases coming out and have involvement there. So moving on to 2.7, so this is the feature release we're working on at the moment, and the feature freeze is at the end of next month, and the GA is expected early in the new year. So I won't touch on the features because Andreas will be covering those in more detail and more intelligibly than I would this afternoon. So I'll focus instead on the newer Linux distro support. So Red Hat 7 is in plan at the moment, and for client support, and that's routinely building and going through testing at the moment. SLES 12 is not GA at the moment. There was a public beta out in February, so obviously people are aware that there will be a GA version at some point in the near future. As that's been one of the nice things with us being at Intel, is we do have connections that we didn't have formally to major Linux distributions, and do have access to pre-release versions of code and information under NDA that about timelines of things. So we're definitely when a release does come out of SLES 12, we'll definitely be in a good position to be able to offer support for that. The Upstream Lustre client as well is an area that there's been some developments recently. So it was it's the 3.11 kernel anyway. I think it was a year ago, or maybe a little more. Some others probably remember better than me. But that it was first in the staging area. It's still in the staging area, but we've made some headway recently in meeting some of the requirements of the Upstream community. It's still an ongoing work. There's still work to be done, but we do have a more concrete list of things we need to get through, and people actively working on them. So that's encouraging. And this isn't sort of a vague future thing anymore. This is something we're going to have to deal with soon. Some of the newer Linux distributions coming out do have a version of that in the so the new Ubuntu Ubuntu 14 and LAD'12 do have, are on kernel versions that will have that, a Lustre client there. So that does present some logistical issues as well about how we're going to, handle things when there is a Lustre client present and you want to build on a, one of, our Lustre clients for whatever reason to sort of work through those kind of challenges. So OLEG's created a ticket, LU5628, to track those kind of things. So if you have thoughts about that, anything that we may have missed, or suggestions about how to effectively handle it, that would be a great focal point to work through that. Release testing as well is something that people are often interested in. This is, we've had our continuous testing practices going on for some time now. Again, Intel has been very generous in terms of the hardware budgets we've had, and I heard just last week that since we joined Intel, the number of test nodes dedicated to our release testing has increased 5 times in the sort of just over 2 years we've been with Intel. And we intend to increase that still further. I mean, it's just a fact of life in HPC that nothing stands still, and we continually need to evolve the testing we're doing. There's always new software coming out, new features we need to test, new hardware to work with. So, and plus, we need to continually be raising the bar in terms of quality. So, some of the things we've been looking at recently. I wanted to also like to mention Hyperion as well, and thank the sysadmin team there for all their flexibility. We use Hyperion extensively with our release validation. But we have, this summer, we've changed some of the ways we have that configured. So we have, instead of wiping out, we have a portion of the file system that we still do our, previous practices of wiping out, maybe spending a week just validating a given, build for a release. We also have a portion set aside that we have an ongoing file system that's just so we can track if there's any different behavior to long-running, long-lived file systems as opposed to ones that are just only in existence for a week and stress tested and during that time, but not just to see if there's any differences over time as file systems get fuller or more fragmented. Also, static code analysis tools. Sebastian Busson of Bull gave a presentation about the use of Coverity at this event a couple of years ago. And that resulted in quite a number of fixes coming up. I mean, these static analysis tools are really interesting because they can often help you find things that may not be as apparent from observing the symptoms. And so, as well as the Bull work with Coverity, OpenSFS funded some work as part of a recent contract using Clang, and John Hammond did some work there to remove some dead code. And we've also got an Intel tool that we're using to run against master and continually, find any, with new landings, anything new that comes up that we can, we need to correct. Release documentation, this is basically just a plug. This is the lowest bar for contribution to anyone. So if any sysadmins are there and you find there's something in the manual where the instructions are not accurate, incomplete, missing, there was a presentation that Richard Henwood gave at LUG recently, which gives the full details about this area and how you could make changes and corrections to the manual yourself. If that's too much trouble, if you just open a ticket so it's documented what the issue is, then maybe somebody else can take care of it and ensure that no one else has to struggle with inaccurate information. So documentation isn't just the manual as well. There's the code documentation, and that's an area that there's been some improvements recently. Some of the design documents are now being stored in the tree, and that's a practice we are going to continue going forward. And OpenSFS also funded some documentation of certain modules of the code, which is, and we expect to have that in for 2.7. And finally, to do a plug for the Lustre Working Group. So this is now combined what was formerly the Technical Working Group and the Community Development Working Group, and now just one group to cover all Lustre matters, and with a combined remit of both groups previously. And so it would be great to have participation from Europe to make sure that your views are getting represented. If it's too difficult to attend meetings, even just being on the mailing list and chipping in or asking questions is a great way to work when we're so distributed as a community. I think that's everything. So does anyone have any questions? Okay, well, if people are shy, come talk to me on a break. I'm happy to chat.
I have one. When will be available the next maintenance release of Lustre?
When we next switch from 2.5 to
2 something?
2 something.
End of next year? Or?
We talked about like 18 months being about right. So that would mean like a 2.8 sort of time frame with the current cadence. But I don't know myself like when was the right time, but I would say at the moment was too soon, because it seems like the switch from 2.4 to 2.5 caused a lot of confusion, and it would be really good to recover from that. I think the biggest driver that would make it worthwhile to consider a switch would be newer Linux distribution support. So I think that's going to really depend upon when people are wanting to move to Red Hat 7s or SLES 12s, and I've been asking that question a lot with that in mind basically, and I think the soonest I've heard is maybe the tail end of next year that people are the earliest I've heard of people starting to consider that. So
yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Is there a group reviewing architecture of Lustre?
Well, I suppose that would be now the Lustre Working Group.
Okay, like currently you have one NDT and OSS, OST. So are there somebody looking at to reconfigure those and then coming out with a better performance from Lustre?
So you mean, is there a group who's looking at like reference like architectures? Well, I think that vendors do that. Like, that's not something that's necessarily centralized, but so yes, I know the vendors would do that because they would have their ideal. Here's how here's how you have good success with Lustre.
I got a question.
All right.
Usually there was 6 months between each release. For 2.7. It's a little bit longer. Did you change your release scheme?
Oh no, because we had bumped along, we didn't want to have the stabilization period was overlapping the holidays, or we just wanted to accept that people take time off over the holidays, and so we just put a month in. With our team, it's staggered even because we have a lot of people in China and they have a week out a bit later, and in Russia the Orthodox Christmas is a little later than the Western calendar Christmas.
Okay. And so for 2.8, should we expect 6 months after 2.7 or something else?
That's the current thinking, yeah. If things come to the schedule, that would be what we would expect. That would be a reasonable period with a 6-month period.
Okay.
That'll be right in the middle of summer, so it might be.
Is it a requirement for the next maintenance release to support Red Hat 7 servers?
Yeah, I would say that people will want that, and that would make sense. So we've got, we're not, although we're officially testing, we know we set a conservative goal of having the clients working. Server support's pretty close, but it's a much bigger thing to completely have that validated at scale that it's rock solid. So it may well be there functional, but just not on the not completely validated for 2.7.
The patches and work is already largely complete in terms of implementing the server support, right? So it's just a matter of
and that's
getting
like,
it landed and
right. But that's the first step of like a multiple step process before you could say, sure, feel good about going ahead and, you know, deploying that into production.
Peter, I see lots of commits about unified target feature. What is Release planned for this feature, and how it will be integrated, tested, and where it is documented? And don't see this feature in our presentation.
I think, are you covering that, Andreas? In your...
I'm not speaking specifically about unified targets, but I could.
Yeah, I mean...
yeah, so the unified target is sort of infrastructure for data on MDT. And so that project was run through OpenSFS, and the designs of all the designs are available, I think, on the OpenSFS.
Yeah, the OpenSFS wiki has all the designs for those. But I think those aren't those going into the tree, like those designs. That was part of the.
Well, that was done beforehand. I mean, we could still land them. Yeah, it just wasn't done yet.
Yeah.
But that code won't really be usable until, or won't be used for anything until data on MDT is landed.
Okay, thanks everyone.